A blurred black-and-white photograph from 1944 captures a radiant, hopeful bride. Yet, the space directly behind her remains empty and chillingly silent. There is no sign of her powerful mother or prestigious siblings. On May 6th, Kathleen Kennedy stood inside the Caxton Hall Register office in London to marry the man she had waited years for. Inside that cramped room, her family's absence was plain. To understand why an American icon was abandoned by her dynasty, we must return to where it began. A place she belonged to not by blood, but through one fatal choice. Tucked deep within the quiet, isolated Derbyshire countryside of England, a cold stone holds a name that America has largely chosen to forget. The engraving on the moss-covered stone still reads, "Joy she gave, joy she has found." The words are simple, and the setting around them says enough. The grave sits within the boundaries of the 500-year-old Cavendish family estate, physically and symbolically separated from the grand Kennedy plots across the ocean. This split geography perfectly defines a fractured existence. She carried the famous Kennedy name by birth, but she was buried and eternally embraced as a Cavendish. The grave makes the split plain. By birth, she was a Kennedy. In death, she rested among the Cavendishes. That contrast says more than any family statement ever could. The setting gives that fact a colder weight. Edensor was not a place built for Kennedy memory. It was a village shaped by old stone walls, low church windows, and Cavendish names that had belonged to England for centuries. Her grave did not sit beside a campaign monument or a presidential library. It sat in a quiet churchyard where the wind moved through the grass, and the family that accepted her kept its promise without needing cameras. 6 years before her burial in England, this 18-year-old girl stood out in London high society for her energy, quick wit, and refusal to conform. She did not need the Kennedy name to make the room notice her. She chewed gum, laughed loudly, and moved through London without the careful elegance people expected. Her unrestrained laughter echoed loudly through silent aristocratic drawing rooms, especially when she cheerfully addressed the imposing Duke of Marlborough with the mocking nickname Dukey Wookie. Unlike her heavily scrutinized siblings, who constantly rehearsed their roles for public perfection, Kick did not secure the English elite with Kennedy wealth or political leverage. She won them over by being fully herself. She injected a raw, natural energy into rooms that were suffocating under centuries of rigid etiquette. Crowned Debutante of the Year in 1938, she brought a kind of energy that London society responded to immediately. The title mattered less than the way she moved through those rooms. Her father's position opened doors, but it did not explain the reaction she created once she stepped through them. Embassy dinners could introduce a young woman to powerful guests. They could not teach her how to make bored aristocrats laugh or move through stiff rooms without fear. Kick understood attention as something living, not something formal. She could turn a guarded conversation into a private joke, and that made her difficult to dismiss. The English press quickly realized that she possessed something far more powerful than traditional beauty. She carried an overwhelming presence that instantly made everyone else in the room feel uniquely important. While other young women meticulously guarded their reputations with practiced reserve, she navigated the intense social season with a brilliant, reckless joy. She did not attempt to mimic the constrained manners of the British aristocracy. She disrupted them, forcing the rigid social hierarchy to accept her entirely on her own terms. Her presence changed the atmosphere of the rooms she entered, not with polish alone, but with a kind of directness people remembered. Her appeal did not come from money or planning. It came from energy people could feel the moment she entered a room. In a world defined by strict rules, her refusal to conform became one of her greatest advantages. It was during a lavish royal summer party that she found a world entirely opposite to her own loud dynasty. Billy Cavendish stood quietly amidst the noisy Buckingham Palace crowd, presenting a picture of measured calm. A look passed between them, bridging the massive gap between their distinct realities. She was a girl conditioned for the brutal competition of the Kennedy machine, while he was a young man raised to silently bear the massive weight of an inherited title. Billy was an educated English aristocrat, but to Kik, he represented the exact quietness she constantly craved. The Kennedy environment relentlessly demanded constant performance, aggressive ambition, and exhausting volume. Billy offered a safe harbor where she did not have to earn love through relentless achievement. They met in the summer of 1938, when he was simply the Marquis of Hartington. His steady demeanor anchored her restless spirit, offering a profound contrast to the chaotic political theater of her childhood. In his quiet strength, she discovered a different kind of power, one that did not require shouting to be heard. He provided the grounding force she needed to finally step away from her family's overwhelming shadow. It was a dazzling summer, filled with garden parties and endless possibilities. It was the final summer before Europe, and Kik's world went to war. But the Kennedy power structure never tolerated a loss of control. The moment the first bomb threatened London, they used the pretext of protection to steal the freedom she had just discovered. In September 1939, as the skies over Poland darkened with the heavy smoke of conflict, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy issued an order that allowed no resistance. Britain had officially declared war. The Patriarch mandated an immediate evacuation for his entire family. Kik pleaded to remain in the city she had conquered, but her requests were flatly denied. Her frightened eyes remained fixed on the fading London harbor as the massive ship slowly pulled away from the dock. Her footsteps felt unusually heavy as she reluctantly boarded the evacuation vessel. She was physically leaving behind the young man she loved, who was already preparing to wear a military uniform. The official family justification framed this forced departure as a necessary measure for wartime safety. However, beneath that protective narrative lay a far more brutal truth about her existence. Kik had almost no genuine legal or practical control over her own destiny. The powerful Kennedy apparatus could easily extract her physical body from the danger zone. They could lock her safely behind the high walls of their American compound. Yet, they could never extract the memory of England from her mind. They could not erase Billy Cavendish from her soul. The psychological separation inflicted upon her that day merely hardened her internal resolve. She crossed the Atlantic Ocean as a reluctant passenger, returning to a country that suddenly felt like a foreign land. The geographic distance was vast, but the emotional chasm growing between the daughter and her family was immeasurably deeper. The next 4 years in America were not a sanctuary. The estate felt controlled, watched, and hard to breathe inside. Even safety came with rules, mass, scrutiny, and the constant expectation that she obey. Between 1939 and 1943, she volunteered for the Red Cross and worked as a researcher at the Washington Times-Herald. Yet, her daily existence remained heavily monitored by an unforgiving matriarch. Work gave her some movement, but it did not give her the country she missed. At the newspaper, she could read dispatches from Europe and feel the war pulling at the life she had left behind. In Red Cross work, she could place herself near usefulness instead of sitting still as a protected daughter. Yet every practical step forward still led back to the same domestic boundary. The family could tolerate service. It could tolerate charm. It could not easily tolerate a daughter choosing a future outside its control. At Sunday Mass, Rose Kennedy's presence reinforced the discipline of the house. Rose Kennedy cast a sharp, unrelenting gaze across the pews, watching every movement her children made. She demanded a flawless public image of Catholic piety at all times. Inside the Kennedy household, religion was not only about comfort or belief, it was also a system of discipline and control. Rose utilized strict religious obedience to maintain total control over her offspring. She weaponized devotion, transforming religious compliance into the sole measure of human value within her home. If you stepped outside the accepted dogma, you risked losing your position in the family hierarchy. Kick slowly but surely recognized the stark, dangerous reality of her specific situation. This tailored uniform of family faith was suffocating her. It steadily pressed against her right to live as an independent individual. The rigid rules dictated who she could love and how she must live. Every forced prayer and every public appearance reminded her how little control she had over her own life. She was firmly trapped in a gilded cage built of holy expectations. She played the role of the dutiful daughter while secretly reading international news, searching for any trace of the world she had lost. The endless American safety they constantly promised her was instead a carefully designed method of spiritual and emotional confinement. The real barrier was not distance alone. It was the conflict between Catholic doctrine, Protestant inheritance, and the expectation that any future Devonshire heir would remain within the Church of England. Billy Cavendish never once demanded that Kick abandon her God. The issue was not only marriage, it was inheritance, lineage, and the public expectation that the Devonshire future remain visibly Protestant. For Rose Kennedy, the matter touched salvation. For the Cavendishes, it touched continuity, title, and the public shape of a Protestant house. This conflict transcended a standard disagreement between two young lovers. That is why the argument could not be solved by a private promise between Kick and Billy. Love could settle what two people wanted. It could not settle what two families believed they were protecting. The Kennedys heard a religious breach. The Devonshire circle saw questions of inheritance and public continuity. Kick stood between those systems, not because she failed to understand them, but because she understood too clearly what each side expected her to surrender. It was a hard conflict between a woman's personal freedom and the pressure to preserve a historic family line. She found herself mercilessly pushed into a dark corner with no safe exit available. The young woman had to make an impossible, agonizing choice regarding her entire future. Would she choose the promised spiritual salvation that aligned perfectly with her mother's rigid expectations? Or would she bravely follow the undeniable, authentic rhythm of her own beating heart? And so, in the year 1943, while the world continued to fracture, that young woman decided to cross the dangerous ocean once more. This time, she deliberately prepared to defy the sacred rules her powerful dynasty had written for her. The decision to proceed with a civil marriage sent a shock through the Kennedy family. It challenged Rose's faith, Joseph's control, and the clean public script the family preferred. In 1943, she had engineered her return to England through the American Red Cross, deliberately positioning herself closer to the life she wanted. The immediate reaction from her mother arrived in the form of cold, sharp handwriting, pressed firmly onto heavy paper. Rose Kennedy delivered a chilling, spiritual punishment, explicitly labeling her daughter's impending marriage as a mortal sin. It is necessary to examine this judgment fairly. Rose did not operate as a simplistic villain within this historical narrative. Her actions stemmed from a profound, terrifying belief in eternal damnation. Yet, the hardest cruelty lay in how she weaponized that spiritual consequence, effectively holding maternal love hostage to force her daughter into submission. This severe religious ultimatum stood in stark contrast to the quiet, steady hand resting on Kick's shoulder in the corner of the room. Her eldest brother, Joe Jr., offered a different perspective. He explicitly advised her to simply follow her heart. Amidst the intense political calculations of the dynasty, he was the only member who looked at her and recognized an independent woman possessing the fundamental right to choose her own destiny, rather than viewing her as a mere political pawn. He granted her the sole permission she desperately needed to move forward. She possessed the agency to defy her matriarch, but the psychological cost of stepping outside the approved family framework was heavy. Joe Jr.'s support mattered because it came from inside the same machine that was trying to contain her. He knew the language of Kennedy duty as well as anyone. He had been raised to carry the family's hopes, to obey its public code, and to understand what disobedience could cost. When he chose to stand with Kick, he did not remove the danger. He made it possible for her to walk into that danger without feeling entirely alone. The structure of her childhood was collapsing around her, leaving her dependent on the future she was trying to build across the dark ocean and aware of the damage she was leaving behind. On May 6, 1944, inside the Caxton Hall Register Office in London, the bride smiled her brightest smile inside the emptiest, coldest room. She deliberately bypassed the lavish, flowing white gowns strictly expected of her high status. Instead, Kick wore a remarkably simple, pale pink suit. Her fingers tightly gripped a fresh, vibrant bouquet of pink camellias sent directly from the sprawling Chatsworth estate of her new family. The only physical trace of her bloodline in that room was the sharp, definitive scratch of Joe Jr.'s ink pen as he signed his name on the thin marriage registry. Jack Kennedy was entirely absent, recovering from severe combat injuries sustained in the Pacific Theater. Rose Kennedy was conspicuously missing, having flatly refused to attend the civil ceremony. The reality was that the Kennedy machine did not require physical force to discipline their rogue daughter. They used absence as punishment. By collectively boycotting the most sacred day of her life, the family delivered a devastating psychological blow, coldly demonstrating the exact, exorbitant price of her disobedience. She had successfully fought for and won the ultimate right to choose her partner, but she paid for that victory by enduring the total abandonment of the people who created her. The visual contrast in that register office was agonizing. A young woman stood in the middle of her wedding and understood that her happiness had come at the cost of family estrangement. The silence from across the Atlantic hung heavy over the vows, proving that independence for a Kennedy woman required complete estrangement. She looked at the man beside her, knowing he was now her only anchor. The ink dried on the registry, officially binding her to a different world and severing her from the one she had just escaped. The room was not empty because the family lacked time to reach it. It was empty because absence had been chosen as the message. That made the ceremony both intimate and brutal. Friends could smile. Billy's relatives could offer warmth. Joe Jr. could sign his name. But the missing faces behind her carried the force of a verdict, and Kik understood exactly what it meant to accept happiness under that silence. That warmth mattered because it gave Kik steadiness in the middle of war. For a short time, it made marriage feel like a real place to stand. But the marriage barely had time to settle into ordinary life. She had waited 6 long years to call him her husband. The world gave them only a handful of weeks together before military duty pulled him back into the war. About 5 weeks after the wedding, he was deployed. Kik remained alone in London, waiting for him to return. Their marriage had almost no chance to become ordinary. There was barely enough time for shared habits, private irritation, or the small domestic routines that make a marriage feel real after the ceremony ends. The war took Billy back before they could build that quieter life. What remained for Kik was not a settled home, but a title, a promise, and a set of letters arriving from a front that kept moving. In the early days of September 1944, a crumpled letter carrying the faint, metallic scent of dirt and gunpowder arrived in Kik's hands from the front lines of Belgium. The hurried, slanted handwriting belonged to her husband. Billy meticulously described the overwhelming scenes of European liberation, noting the bright, vibrant flowers that desperate civilians were pressing onto the cold steel turrets of passing British tanks. He was standing in the exact center of one of the most monumental military victories of the 20th century. Yet, as the heir to a 500-year-old empire, surrounded by the deafening cheers of newly freed crowds, Billy Cavendish did not write about personal glory or battlefield triumph. The record shows a man entirely stripped of aristocratic pretense. His focus remained anchored across the English Channel. He offered a remarkably raw, unshielded confession that cuts sharply through the historical archive. He wrote that he had a permanent lump in his throat while watching the celebrations. He admitted he longed for her to be there to share the experience. For Kik, that line did more than comfort her. It gave shape to the life she had chosen against everyone's warning. Billy was not writing as a distant aristocrat performing affection. He was writing as a husband who wanted his wife beside him in the middle of history. The words were simple, but they carried the proof she needed. The sacrifice had not been one-sided. He had built his private future around her too. At the height of his military journey, his only genuine desire was the presence of his wife standing beside him. That single sentence serves as undeniable proof of a steady love. It gave meaning to the price Kik had paid to stand at the altar with him 4 months earlier. She had defied a powerful matriarch, crossed a treacherous ocean, and surrendered her position within the Kennedy hierarchy just to receive those words. The letter proved that her massive sacrifice was not a foolish rebellion. It was a perfectly weighted exchange. She held that paper in London, reading the lines over and over, firmly believing that the worst of the global conflict was finally behind them. Those tender words had barely dried on the paper before enemy fire violently severed their timeline. On September 10th, 1944, Billy was killed in Belgium. A cold, official casualty notice soon slipped from Kick's trembling fingers, fluttering silently to the floor of her London residence. She had waited 6 agonizing years to marry the man she loved, but the war gave them only a little over 4 months as husband and wife. Their marriage had barely begun to settle into ordinary life. She managed to draft a short, devastated note to a close friend, the pen shaking violently in her grip. The brief, shattered message read, "Life is so cruel. Writing is impossible." But the universe was not finished dismantling her spirit. Joe Jr. had already died over the English Channel on August 12th, and Billy was killed less than a month later. The chronology mattered, but so did the brutal order in which she was forced to absorb it. Joe Jr. was not just her brother. He was the only member of her powerful bloodline who had unconditionally supported her defiant choice, the only Kennedy who had bothered to sign her marriage registry. The family apparatus had already weaponized their absence to punish her. But the indiscriminate violence of war took away the 2 men she valued most. Within a single month, the 2 men who mattered most to her were gone, leaving her exposed in a city still waiting for the war to end. She was 24 years old, entirely stripped of her primary protectors, standing alone in a foreign capital, while the rest of the world blindly celebrated the slow approach of military victory. There was no clean public language for that kind of loss. Victory headlines were beginning to form, but her own life was narrowing into telegrams, condolence notes, and rooms where people lowered their voices when she entered. The world could talk about sacrifice as an idea. Kick was being asked to live inside it before she had even reached 25. At 24, the Kennedys expected grief to send her back into the family fold. Instead, she stayed in England. At Christmas of 1944, Billy's empty chair remained at the Cavendish table, and the Duchess of Devonshire made clear that Kick's place there had not disappeared with her husband. That mattered because England, for all its distance and stiffness, allowed her grief to exist without demanding obedience. In that choice, Kick made plain which world still felt livable to her. Within the highly polished Kennedy empire, rules were never applied equally to both genders. The historical record reveals a stark, deeply entrenched double standard actively protected by the family apparatus. Picture the alternating images of the Kennedy men freely navigating a series of brief, complicated romantic affairs. Their triumphant smiles flashed constantly in the public eye, carefully shielded from the aggressive press by their burgeoning political careers and the relentless family public relations machine. The patriarch, Joseph Sr. and his sons, were routinely granted a private freedom denied to the daughters. They could engage in complex private lives without facing the same public cost or the same threat of exile from the family fold. The dynasty actively absorbed and erased their indiscretions. But Kick experienced an entirely different reality. Here was a woman who loved fiercely and faithfully. She had married properly in the eyes of the law, stood loyally by her chosen partner, and personally buried her husband in the cold ground. Yet, her own bloodline judged and punished her as if she carried a grave moral failing. She was held to a grueling, unforgiving standard that her brothers were never forced to endure. This was the harsh hypocrisy of a family image built on the illusion of a perfect, pious facade. The men were allowed to conquer without consequence, while the daughters were expected to suffer in obedient silence. She had paid the ultimate price for her independence, isolated by the very people who preached family unity. Their selective morality protected the sons while pushing the daughter outside the family circle. The difference was not only moral, it was practical. The sons were treated as future instruments of power, so their private contradictions could be managed, softened, or hidden. A daughter's rebellion offered the family no obvious political benefit. It created risk without giving the machine anything it could easily use. That made Kik dangerous in a way her brothers rarely were. Her choices could not be folded neatly into the story Joseph Kennedy wanted America to see. Just when her internal world seemed sealed, a new current of electricity sparked across the young widow's life. The setting was a bustling London charity ball in 1946. A waltz was playing in the crowded room. Through the sea of formal attire, the charming, deeply experienced, and vividly alive smile of the 8th Earl, Peter Fitzwilliam, emerged as he walked deliberately toward her. He was wealthy, a Protestant, and currently entangled in the messy process of divorcing his wife, Olive. To understand Kik's choices, one must clearly separate her two great romances. If Billy Cavendish was the quiet, grounding safe harbor she desperately needed at 18, Peter Fitzwilliam was an intense, undeniable surge of raw stimulation. He did not and could not replace the sacred memory of her first love. That space remained occupied. Instead, Peter represented something entirely different for the 27-year-old widow. He was living proof that her heart still possessed the physical capacity to feel the heavy, racing pulse of life. She fundamentally refused to lock herself away in a dark room and freeze forever inside her past trauma. The aristocratic society expected her to gently fade into the background as a perpetual mourner, a tragic ghost lingering on the edges of their grand estates. She rejected that assigned role. She wanted to continue living, to participate in the world, and to experience joy again. Peter Fitzwilliam offered a way back into ordinary life, a chance to breathe without the constant, suffocating weight of grief pressing down on her chest. She grabbed that lifeline with both hands, fully aware of the dangerous territory she was stepping into. She was choosing her own survival over the quiet, respectable death society had planned for her. That did not make the relationship simple or clean. Peter carried his own complications, and the divorce surrounding him made the relationship impossible to present as harmless. Kik understood that. She was not stepping into innocence. She was stepping into another choice that would be judged harshly because it belonged to her. After everything she had lost, even a flawed chance at living again seemed more honest than perform in permanent widowhood for people who had already failed her. But once again, her pursuit of personal happiness collided directly with the Kennedy political machine. Back in Massachusetts, the first romantic rumors would have landed as a serious problem inside the family circle. Kick was seriously involved with a high-profile Protestant nobleman, and even more dangerously, one actively navigating a very public divorce. During this exact period, her brother Jack's political career was gaining rapid momentum among conservative American Catholic voters. The timing could not have been worse for the dynasty's soaring ambitions. Kick's new relationship was instantly viewed by her family as a political risk that threatened the clan's honor and its Catholic voting base. The deeply scarred 27-year-old woman, who had already buried a husband and a brother in the war, was once again forced to beg for the simple right to love. The family treated her private life as if her very existence was their shared political property, a risk to be managed or suppressed. They demanded she sacrifice her second chance at happiness to safeguard Jack's pristine public image. But Kick was no longer the naive 18-year-old girl who could be easily banished to another continent. This time, she decided to face her powerful father directly to demand his understanding and reclaim her autonomy. She booked the tickets, ready to force a conversation that had been delayed for years. That should have been a flight of reconciliation and empathy. But the trip ended in disaster before that conversation could happen. In the spring of 1948, Kick embarked on a hazardous journey not to escape her reality, but to seek a final, desperate connection. She had no intention of betraying her family a second time. A tightly clenched hand gripped the railing as she boarded the small de Havilland Dove aircraft. Her determined eyes remained fixed on the horizon, focused on the task ahead. Inside the cabin, a flight map lay spread open across a small table, tracing a direct path toward the French Riviera. Her powerful father, Joseph Kennedy, was currently traveling in Europe, and he was the ultimate destination of this crucial flight. She was flying directly into the heart of the patriarch's domain. The 28-year-old widow wanted to face him in person, refusing to hide her new relationship in the shadows. She sought a fundamental human understanding, perhaps a reluctant blessing, or at the very least, a silent nod of permission to live the remainder of her fractured life without carrying the permanent label of a sinner. She had already endured the agonizing cost of family exile, and she was doing everything within her power to mend the broken bridge between her biological roots and her chosen future. She was ready to negotiate her right to exist on her own terms. Joseph Kennedy's approval still mattered because he remained the one person capable of softening the family's official posture. Rose might condemn. Jack might calculate. The younger siblings might stay silent. But Joseph could decide whether the family would keep treating Kick as a problem or finally make room for the woman she had become. That made the flight feel so charged. She was trying to recover a place at the family table without surrendering her own life. The young woman carried the heavy burden of her past tragedies into that small cabin, hoping to exchange them for a second chance at peace. It was a bold, calculated move by a daughter who refused to be entirely erased from her own narrative. She boarded the plane, believing that one conversation might finally ease the conflict between her family and the life she wanted. But forgiveness from her family never arrived in time. Instead, she received the blind, unyielding fury of nature. On May 13, 1948, the aircraft departed from Croydon Airport and flew directly into an atmospheric nightmare over France. For 20 agonizing minutes, the small plane violently wrestled with severe turbulence inside the dark center of a massive storm. The deafening scream of the overstressed engines was quickly followed by the horrific, metallic sound of the aircraft physically tearing apart. The wings violently ripped away from the main fuselage under the immense atmospheric pressure. The small cockpit tumbled uncontrollably through the turbulent air before the entire ruined aircraft plummeted straight down into a dark, rocky ravine near Saint-Beauzile in the Ardèche region. It was a sudden, catastrophic aviation tragedy that resulted in a permanent separation from the world she fought so hard to navigate. At exactly 28 years old, just as she had meticulously gathered enough fragile courage to open her heart to love a second time, destiny abruptly extinguished her future in one fatal impact. Kik died alongside Peter Fitzwilliam, pilot Peter Townshend, and navigator Arthur Freeman. She died suspended in the violent air, desperately reaching for a resolution she would never physically attain. She was caught on the dangerous boundary between two realities that had never learned how to share her. One side contained the bloodline that raised her, and the other side held the independent life she had carved out for herself. The brutal storm erased all her carefully laid plans, instantly transforming a journey of hopeful reconciliation into a scene of devastation. Her physical journey ended violently against the cold French mountainside, forever silencing the crucial words she had crossed a continent to finally deliver. No final conversation took place in a hotel room. No reluctant blessing was given. No argument had the chance to become forgiveness. The crash froze the conflict before anyone could be forced to answer her directly. Her family never had to reject the request she was bringing because the storm arrived first. The family moved quickly to control the story after the crash. Behind closed doors, the family began cutting away the parts of the story that threatened them. Look closely at the carefully curated newspaper headlines of the era, where thick black ink deliberately erased all romantic context from the tragedy. The public version tried to present the trip as casual and unimportant, stripping it of its romantic meaning. The dynasty sanitized the reality of her final days to protect their own soaring ambitions, publicly acknowledging that a Kennedy daughter was romantically involved with a married Protestant nobleman actively seeking a divorce was deemed an unacceptable political risk. That truth could have complicated the family's standing with conservative Catholic voters and created problems for Jack Kennedy's political future. The family had every reason to keep her real story from complicating the image they were building at home. Consequently, even as her physical body lay broken in a foreign morgue, her entire life was carefully edited and softened to serve the dynasty's pristine public image. The family version of events stripped away much of her agency and complexity, reducing her final, desperate pursuit of happiness into a sanitized footnote that would not threaten the political ascent of her brother. Her genuine desires were pushed aside by the very people who were supposed to protect her historical memory. The world was officially notified of her untimely death, but the agonizing reason she was on that doomed flight was carefully buried. And that calculated coldness extended all the way to her open grave, where those who shared her blood refused to say a final goodbye. At the quiet Edensor Cemetery, the Cavendish family restored the ultimate dignity that her own bloodline intentionally ignored. Her burial carried a striking contradiction. a formal Catholic funeral was arranged and hosted by a Protestant aristocratic family. They ensured the woman who loved their son received the exact spiritual rights her own mother had accused her of abandoning. By the open grave, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy stood alone. His posture was visibly broken, his eyes carrying a heavy devastation, and his normally pristine suit hung awkwardly on his aging frame. He was the sole representative of the American dynasty to attend the burial of his own daughter. History records a chilling absence in that English churchyard. The empty places around the grave told the story without any added explanation. Rose Kennedy was absent. The matriarch remained firmly stationed across the Atlantic Ocean. Various explanations were later circulated by the family apparatus regarding fragile health or insurmountable travel logistics. Yet, the historical record shows a colder truth. She simply did not cross the water to watch her child descend into the cold earth. The mother who weaponized faith to punish her daughter's independence maintained her harsh distance until the very end. This absence sharpened the tragedy of her life. What remained at the grave was not a debate over doctrine. It was a father standing there without the rest of his family, surrounded by people who had every historical reason to reject a Catholic Kennedy, and still chose to honor her. The scene was spare and difficult to soften. The woman who had been accused of betraying her faith was laid to rest with Catholic rites by the very English house she had joined for love. At the end, the Cavendishes gave her a dignity that the Kennedys never publicly gave. After the burial, the work of erasure began. Later, Kennedy genealogies hurried past her name, and no public grief from Jack Kennedy altered the family's silence. The circumstances of her final flight were too dangerous to his political future to be left untouched. A simplified version of her life was allowed to harden into public memory, and it did so by stripping away her agency. That kind of erasure rarely announces itself as cruelty. It often appears as neat wording, careful timing, and the removal of inconvenient context. A complicated woman becomes a sad accident. A contested relationship becomes a vague trip. A daughter trying to confront her father becomes a passenger in a story told by others. Once that simplified version begins to circulate, it becomes easier for a powerful family to let silence do the rest. The loss was not only personal. Kick had made choices that exposed the gap between the Kennedy image and Kennedy reality. She loved across religious lines, crossed the Atlantic against pressure, married without full family blessing, refused to return home as a defeated widow, and later tried to love again. None fit neatly inside the story of Catholic respectability being built for American politics. It would take 15 long years for that heavy silence to be pierced by the loud, rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades cutting through the quiet English countryside. On June 29, 1963, the sitting American president finally arrived. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy broke away from his highly publicized diplomatic tour of Ireland to make a private detour. He walked alone across the damp grass toward his sister's burial site. There were no press photographers allowed, and no official communication strategies deployed. He quietly knelt on the damp earth, his hand carefully placing a bouquet of flowers upon the cold stone marker. He remained there, silently reading the inscription chosen by the in-laws who had loved her without conditions. Jack had missed the small civil wedding in London. He had missed the solemn Catholic funeral in Derbyshire. 15 years later, the president finally arrived to offer a haunting, unspoken apology to the sister he had left behind in the dark. The solitary visit lasted for less than 1 hour before he returned to the demands of his office. The tragic irony of this delayed reunion is staggering. Destiny refused to grant them any opportunity for a genuine second chance. Less than 5 months after he knelt by her gravestone, the president was assassinated in Dallas. History left them no second chance and no private moment to repair what ambition had damaged. There would never be another visit, nor another chance to bridge the gap created by their family's ambition. Every unsaid word and every delayed apology arrived too late. They were left under the weight of history, where no apology could reach her in time. At that dark cemetery, only the words carved in stone remain, speaking the entire truth. The living tried so desperately to deny at any cost. The weathered headstone remains, carrying the words joy she gave, joy she has found. It is still the clearest public sentence left to speak for her. Memory returns to a vivid image of the 18-year-old girl. She is smiling radiantly, casually chewing gum, and striding proudly down a sunlit London street, indifferent to the judging stares. She remains forever 28, separated from her beloved husband by an ocean and alienated from her family by an entire ideology. Kit Kennedy never fit the role her dynasty wanted her to play. She only fit the life she chose, and that was the one transgression her family could never forgive.